So we come back to Luke, and last time I was talking, you were trying to listen. I was talking about the difference between the Luke and Matthew genealogies and how Matthew's genealogy points in the direction of Matthew's Jewish gospel. Luke's genealogy, on the other hand, points to a Gentile gospel, and that's the truth. Luke is geared toward a Gentile audience. And so we get into Luke's gospel a little bit more. And so first we want to talk about who Luke is. Who is he? And to do that, we open up with Luke chapter 1. Notice how it says, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. The use of the first pronoun, I, in verse 3, is telling, in addition to the excellent Greek dedication to whoever Theophilus is. Theophilus could also be a generalized term. That is, Theophilus could refer to, in Greek, it literally means lover or friend of God, and that, of course, you could see how that could be appropriate for a number of people in a generalized setting. But I want to point you directly to this idea. It says, many have undertaken, right? Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account. What in the world would Luke mean by that? And I think what Luke means by that is something that we will also describe, and that is this idea that there are more than just a couple of gospels floating around in the middle of the first century toward the later part of the first century when Luke puts paper to pen. Now we're going to say Luke. In honesty, you can see that the name Luke is not here, and that's because the traditional appropriation of Luke as the author comes from a variety of places. Most notably, Eusebius in his church history. You do have some allusions to Gospels in Papias, the church father. Papias is one of the first ones to organize a canon. But in 144 AD, Marcion, the church heretic, singles Luke out as a source for his church. Marcion is a convert to Christianity, gives about the equivalent of 2 million to the church in Rome so he could become a member. And then when it becomes clear that Marcion's going to be more trouble than what he's worth, the church actually refunds his money, which is amazing when you think about it. Marcion, Marcion. In any event, Luke is well known in the early part of the second century, and so as a gospel, that's the traditional designation. The traditional designation sticks. So now, who are these many eyewitnesses? You could have Matthew, you could have Mark. I don't know if John is around when Luke writes. Certainly you can have another a source or two. We'll see how that works in when we get to that, which will be the next thing we do. I think we're going to cover the four-source theory before we get to John. In any case, Luke decides to compile the narrative for a different context than the narrative that we described for Matthew, the narrative context. And so when you look at Luke's gospel from the very beginning, you notice something is different, and that is this highly literary beginning to verses 1 through 4. Highly literary. Luke has the best Greek in the New Testament. Perhaps the book of Hebrews is as close, and maybe a little more polished in certain respects. Who is Luke writing to? Luke is writing to God-fearers, those whose religious values had been considerably shaped by first century Judaism. God-fearers, and that's becoming more and more disputed as we kind of get the sense of who some of these people were. God-fearers typically and historically had been considered Gentiles who were fans of Judaism. Gentiles were allowed to go to synagogues, and they frequented synagogues and listened to teachings about Moses. And so you first run into God-fearer. I'm going to show you. It's in the second part to Luke's two-part work, and it is Acts chapter 11. Actually, we're going to go back to Acts chapter 10. Here he says, talking about Cornelius. Let's see if we can find. Here's the description of Cornelius in Caesarea. That's on the coast, the Mediterranean coast, the Roman. It's the Jewish town of Caesarea, right on the coast of the Mediterranean. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort. That is, Cornelius had his certifications right from the emperor. He's a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. Now, that is an extraordinary statement for Luke to make. What does it mean that Cornelius would have been somebody who can make prayers constantly to God, and he gave generously with his alms? That's pretty much a quintessential definition of a Gentile God-fearer. And Cornelius in the story he is praying to God, and an angel comes, and then Peter that is supposed to visit, but Peter is not as willing to go to a Gentile household. So God has to drop a giant screen out of heaven where the clean and unclean animals are featured, and that is how Peter begins to awaken to the fact that these Gentiles may be candidates for the earliest Christian communities. And so here's the vision right here. And then finally, after Peter's puzzlement, he visits Cornelius, and he witnesses, and then the verdict comes, and the message is proclaimed. And then all of a sudden, while Peter was still speaking and sharing the news, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. And the circumcised believers, so Jewish believers, who had come with Peter were astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles. So you get the idea that Luke may have this kind of Gentile in mind, a God-fearer. Of course, Luke may be engaged also in an apologetic response to Jewish polemic against the early Christian movement. So Luke writes maybe as a response to the antagonism presented to the early Christian movement from the Jews themselves. But make no mistake, this is diaspora or Hellenistic Judaism, not Palestinian Judaism. Matthew seems to be involved when you're talking about Judea. It's got a lot more qualities that would be appealing to a Jewish audience than does Luke. On the other hand, Luke does have a more cosmopolitan audience in mind. Someone whose birth is not Jewish, and maybe whose background is Hellenistic, either with an acquaintance with Judaism or not. That's the kind of an audience, a refined audience, that Luke has in mind. We've just seen that Luke and Acts are really together. They're sources that are together. And Acts is a continuation of the story. And when you see Luke 2:32, it's obvious that he already has Acts in mind. Look, let's consider that. If you find Luke 2:32, look at what it says. This is on the lips, by the way, of Simeon, who is in the temple when Jesus shows up for his consecration to God and his circumcision, his name, that when they were going to give him his name. And look, he's been sitting there, he's been waiting, and he looks to God after seeing Jesus come in. He holds Jesus into his arms. Master, now you are dismissing your servant in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for the revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. And so you get a sense that Luke's gospel very much is a gospel that has Acts in mind, the spread of the message to the Gentile world. And, you know, when you take into consideration that Luke and Acts are parts 1 and part 2, they form a little more than a quarter of the New Testament material. So Luke and Acts together is a very large field to plow in. So Luke has to be a little later than Mark. Whether Luke and Matthew write, when they write, how they write, is an item of dispute. Acts doesn't record Paul's death, that is the book of Acts, but that does not preclude a pre-62 date. In fact, as I firmly believe that Luke and Acts are both written after Paul's death, and further, that Acts was part 2 of a 3-part work. No one knows, or never even heard, of a third part. As a matter of fact, I haven't even heard anybody come up with that idea except for me, and that's because it's probably a dumb idea. But if you want to take it to the next level, I'll even tell you who it was about. I have a feeling it was about Clement, who would become the leader of the church in Rome and send a letter to the Corinthian church, a letter that Paul was very familiar with and Luke was familiar with, according to the book of Acts. So maybe this was a baton passing from Jesus to Paul and then from Paul to Clement. We don't have it. But it's clear that Acts and Luke are related. There is a movement here from the temple to the city, and the two works between Luke and Acts indicate that the shift was already underway, decentralized, away from the temple. So away from the temple, maybe you're talking about 70 to 90. Maybe the movement away from the temple indicates the demise of the temple. It's important to note that the gospel writers didn't have news cycles like we do. Whether or not the disciples themselves had the notion or had the wherewithal to recognize that the end was coming for the Jerusalem temple, I think you'd have to be on the ground and notice all the soldiers to figure that out. According to the church tradition in 170, the Muratorian canon, the third book of the gospel, according to Luke, that physician after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken him as companion of his journey, composed in his own name on the basis of reports. So that's the Muratorian canon written in 170. Luke does have the reputation of being a physician. There are a lot of indications that the text of Luke has some of these health reminders or health points kind of in mind. And you will read the book of Acts and come across, as you read, the shift from they and he to we. And that is always a little interesting when you come across it, that the writer places himself within the matrix of Paul and the expanding mission in the book of Acts. And there's no doubt that Luke and Acts are connected. For Acts chapter 1, you can look at that on your own, begins very similarly, even noting the same person, Theophilus. Eusebius is another one who writes about this. We alluded to before, Luke being by birth one of the people of Antioch, by profession a physician, having been with Paul a good deal and having associated himself intimately with the rest of the apostles, has left us examples of the art of curing souls that he obtained from them in 2 divinely inspired books. So Eusebius and the Muratorian canon give us this good information on the placement of Luke as the second or the third gospel.